Are two common causes attributed to the English Civil War. The first is viewing the war as a religious conflict, and that was primarily between the Protestant Puritan, specifically Puritan population of England that was in conflict with King Charles I's Armenian tendencies. And Armenianism is much closer to Catholicism than Puritanism. The second cause was a political cause, and he went through an 11-year period called the Era of Personal Rule, where he never called the Parliament once. This was viewed as a violation of the rights of Englishmen, and while Parliament was not in session, Charles took a lot of maneuvers that were viewed as illegal. Well, Edward Whaley and William Goffe had a center role in the English Civil War. They started out just in the common ranks on the parliamentary side, but they were ultimately, they communicated in the same circles. Edward Whaley was a cousin of Oliver Cromwell, the most important figure of the English Civil War, probably second to Charles I. So as Oliver Cromwell rose to power in the English Civil War, Edward Whaley and William Goffe became close confidants of his. In fact, during the war, Cromwell became a very important major general, and his troops, his cavalry specifically, was called the Ironsides Brigade. Edward Whaley in particular was one of Oliver Cromwell's two Ironsides. After the new model army was formed, Edward Whaley and the parliamentary side fighting under Oliver Cromwell, they never lost a single battle. William Goffe, he wasn't quite as important of a military figure, even though he did fight with distinction on several occasions. William Goffe, his primary role during the war was, he was really one of the first people to call for the execution of King Charles I. He referred to King Charles I as a man of blood, in essence meaning that Charles I was willing to sacrifice the very people of his kingdom to preserve his rule. William Goffe really staunchly was the first person to start considering and advocating for the execution of Charles I, and that was very influential and important, and it marks a real change in the direction and tone of the war. Also during the war, John Dixwell, a third regicide who ended up coming to New Haven, did not serve on the battlefield really in any capacity the way Edward Whaley and William Goffe did. Instead, he served as the general of Dover Castle, which is an important town in at the easternmost point really of England, that served as like an entrance and an exit to England from continental Europe. So that was a very important post as well. Okay, during King Charles I's trial, Whaley and Goffe played several important roles. They first participated in Pride's Purge, which was an event where the troops surrounded the House of Parliament and prevented the members who stood against the trial and execution of Charles I, they prevented them from taking their seats. And that left only parliamentary members who were in support of trying the king. Once the trial became underway, John Dixwell, Edward Whaley, and William Goffe all served as reliable jurors of Charles's crime of treason. And they were reliable jurors who undoubtedly would side with the sympathies of Oliver Cromwell. And sure enough, the verdict was unanimous, and for the first time in history, a sitting monarch was tried and found guilty and then executed. So Oliver Cromwell ruled England through a government called the Protectorate from about 1651 to his death in 1658. And Oliver Cromwell ideally would have had his son take power as Lord Protector. but his son really didn't desire to hold that post, and he also really didn't possess the political gravitas to hold power. He didn't have the followers that his father did. So, in essence, there was a political vacuum taking place in England in the late 1650s, and England really didn't know what to do. And so in the midst of this crisis, many members of Parliament really just preferred to revert back to the monarchy system, and they invited Charles II, who was desperate to reclaim his throne, to return from the continent, the European continent, and he arrived in England to cheers of support. It became very obvious to Edward Whaley, William Gough, and John Dixwell that their lives would be in danger, because as part of the negotiations for Charles II to return to the throne, he was willing to forgive everybody in the kingdom for crimes committed against his father and his father's rule. He was willing to forgive everybody except for the men who tried and executed his father. And if your name or your signature was, I can't remember the name of the document. Sorry about that. If a person's name or signature appeared on the warrant for Charles I's execution, then they were deemed a regicide and would be tried for treason against Charles I. The regicides had a variety of choices of where to go if they were going to flee England at all after the return of Charles I. Most of them went to Germany and the Netherlands, and some went to Switzerland. It's interesting that of the 15 regicides who fled England, 3 ultimately chose to come to New England. It was a curious choice. The first thing that made New England attractive to Edward Whaley, William Gough, and John Dixwell was the Puritan sympathies of the New England colonies. In fact, when Edward Whaley and William Gough arrived in Boston, they were greeted as heroes, and they met with the governor, they met with the president of Harvard, and they toured the country. They were provided horses to tour the countryside, and they were real celebrities. They were the most important, most powerful men to ever visit the colonies. People were really excited to meet these men. However, after only a few months, a declaration for their arrest, wanted dead or alive, essentially, changed the sympathies of the Massachusetts citizens. Those who were in support of Whaley and Gough largely became neutral, and those who were neutral might even be a threat to turn Whaley and Gough in, because there was a financial reward for their capture, and there might even have been the possibility of receiving a title of nobility if a person was instrumental in turning them over to the crown. When the governor of Massachusetts, John Endicott, was alerted of the arrival of the warrant for Edward Whaley and William Gough's arrest, he very quickly changed his behavior. Instead of the overt support for the men, he largely remained silent about them and began to oblige the king's orders to arrest them. However, when he made his efforts to try to arrest Edward Whaley and William Gough, he did it rather coyly. He dragged his feet. The men were staying with one of his assistants in his house. So Edward Whaley and William Gough always knew if there was going to be a search and an arrest made. Because Boston was a major port city, it was really not in their best interest to remain there, and they chose another destination, which became New Haven Colony. While all the colonies in New England had Puritan sympathies, New Haven was really the most radical. A second area that New Haven was a little bit different from the other colonies was that it really had no legal standing in King Charles II's eyes to be a separate colony. So on the surface, John Endicott chose to oblige to the king's demands and tried to make it appear that he was a loyal servant of the king. However, behind the scenes, he was really still in support of Whalley and Gough and made many efforts to secure their safety. Once he knew that Whalley and Gough had escaped the city limits of Boston, so to speak, he did conduct a search of the city, and then he appointed two agents, Thomas Kirke and Thomas Kelland, who were really staunch loyalists and vigorously tracked Edward Whalley and William Gough down to the New Haven colony, and were very passionate in their pursuit. When Thomas Kirke and Thomas Kelland arrived in the New Haven colony, they were really hot on the tracks of Edward Whalley and William Gough. They had arrived at Governor Lee's door just off of the town green in Guilford, Connecticut, and Whalley and Gough were really forced to flee downtown New Haven up to a cave on the city limits and really the wilderness, which today is known as Judge's Cave at West Rock State Park.
Great. So Tom, tell us about the unique living experience of Edward Whalley and William Gough.
Well, Whalley and Gough had left England when Charles II was coming to power because they knew their freedom was at risk. And then once the king issued a death warrant for them, they knew their life was at risk.
Right.
So they came to the colonies for safety. And when the king's agents showed up looking for them in New Haven, they knew that town was not the safe place to be anymore. So Richard Sperry, who was an early settler of New Haven, brought them to this spot for safekeeping.
Now, just by looking at it, I'm sure this wasn't the most cozy spot in all the places of Connecticut. So why do you think they wanted to stay here?
Well, their life on the run was difficult, so comfort was not their primary concern. The primary concern was not being captured. So 400 years ago, this was wilderness, and this was not a place someone would just happen to come to because it's at the top of a ridge.
And I see there's like a little opening there. I'm wondering, was that their kind of opening going in and out?
It certainly would be one of the ways to get into the cave if you just duck down low and it opens up. And
Oh, wow. Right. Oh, wow. Really narrow.
Very narrow.
Yes. So this is really an uncomfortable like living situation, even if they're hiding out for like a day or two. I mean, I can't even imagine what was going through their mind when they were in here, when it was raining. So what do you think their situation was when they were in here? Because I can't even imagine being here for like another 5-10 minutes because it's so tight and dense.
No reason to certainly they could have gone outside the cave during the day and sought shelter at night. As to what they did with themselves, I can't imagine what that would have been like. Just hours with not really a lot to do and just hope no one might be showing up by mistake. And then we have heard that on rainy nights they would go down to Richard Sperry's farm and maybe hide in his barn for the evening and then come back up here again. One of the many stories told about the regicides, which we can't necessarily confirm, comes from the Sperry family, in which they said that in June of 1661 when they left, that they were scared off by a mountain lion that looked into the cave and glared at them. That's one story.
Right.
It's possible it happened because certainly there would have been mountain lions back up here in those wilderness days. And we do know from history that in 1664 when they left that there was a band of Indians who were hunting up here as they normally would, and they discovered the cave and then reported it out, so their hiding place was no longer hidden. So it was no longer a safe place for them to be. So we do know that that did happen. And then the other thing to consider would be that why the colonists risked their safety, their lives, and their property to hide these people who are strangers to them. And we have to remember that this was 1661. This is only 41 years after Plymouth Rock, and the same group of Puritans who landed here were followed by others, and they were looking to protect the ones who were also resisting against the king, because we know that Gough's father was a Puritan minister and firmly believed in the religious aspects of what was taking place.
So Tom, if someone wanted to find this place, where would they go about doing so?
Well, the easiest way to do it is in warmer weather from Memorial Day to the end of October. The road up here is open, so they could just drive up from Wintergreen Avenue. And if the road is closed, then you'll have to hike or bicycle up, which you can do either by coming up the road or most directly if you went down to Westville. There's a trail that comes up called the Westville Feeder, which then joins the Regicides Trail, the trail that's named in honor of the fact that the regicides or judges spent time up here almost 400 years ago.
The two primary men who aided Edward Whaley and William Goff in New Haven were certainly the minister of the city or the colony, John Davenport, and the governor, Governor William Leete. John Davenport gave an interesting sermon in the months prior to the arrival of Edward Whaley and William Goff in New Haven Colony. In the service, he essentially told his New Haven parishioners to be welcoming to men who might be controversial in nature. Governor William Leete, on two occasions, once as governor of New Haven, shielded the men from the agents Kirk and Kelland and delayed, and really he was probably the person who was most in danger of being charged with treason for aiding Edward Whaley and William Goff. Edward Whaley and William Goff used Judge's Cave as a hideout to escape searches for their arrest. They used it as a hideout on 3 occasions, and it was the first time that they used it the longest, for about a month. It was during that time that Thomas Kirk and Thomas Kelland were conducting their search, their rather vigorous search for the men in New Haven Colony. They lived up there for about a month, and there is a local legend which is quite humorous, where the men were living really in the shelter of the rocks, and supposedly in the middle of the night, a mountain lion, which were certainly prevalent in Connecticut at the time, a mountain lion had poked its head into the cave, sending the men scurrying down the mountain. And it was after that point that the men decided that they weren't going to live up there any longer, and they went on to live for about 2 years in the town of Milford, which is just south of New Haven. When the agents Thomas Kirk and Thomas Kelland were searching for Edward Whaley and William Goff in New Haven, Governor Leete was really guilty of obstructing justice. He dragged his feet in many ways and prevented the men from continuing their search. And if it wasn't for Governor Leete, it's quite likely that Edward Whaley and William Goff would have been captured. Lots of people knew this, and it became clear that Governor Leete was really getting himself into some hot water and may likely have charges filed against him. So, in an effort to save face, so to speak, a plan was hatched where Edward Whaley and William Goff were to come out of hiding and show themselves in public, thereby clearing Edward Leete of any guilt associated with the men, because by them arriving in public, it made it clear that the men were acting on their own and that William Leete was not, in fact, covering for them. So the men arrived on New Haven Green and said, "We're here to turn ourselves in." And, the New Haven authorities let the men attend church. They took Whaley and William Goff at their word, and they let them attend a church service before they were arrested. And sure enough, after the church service, the men ran back into the woods into hiding. The whole event was designed to clear William Leete of any guilt associated with hiding the men. When Charles II returned to the throne, the New England colonies all had to apply for charters to govern from the king. Most of the New England colonies had charters from Charles I, and that added to their legitimacy. But New Haven, which was really settled in the years surrounding the English Civil War, really didn't have a legitimate claim to found a colony. So they were essentially just squatters on the land. Because of that tenuous claim of legitimacy, it was very likely that New Haven really wasn't going to be able to remain an independent colony, which is what they sorely wanted. It was because of that they were really able to help Edward Whaley and William Goff, and ultimately John Dixwell as well, so brazenly. The other colonies, who had a better opportunity to secure a favorable charter, didn't want to go against the king, at least on the surface. It would be impossible to predict whether New Haven would have remained an independent colony if they had turned in the regicides. It's been suggested that King Charles II punished New Haven for harboring the regicides by placing them under the authority of Connecticut Colony, and that's how the two colonies were united in the 1660s. Upon Charles II's return to the throne, a variety of disputes arose in the colonies, and the king felt it necessary to send a commission with 4 frigates to the New England colonies. Primary purpose was to send them down to New Amsterdam and take over the port city, which ultimately became New York. Well, one of the 4 goals that commission had, beyond seizing New Amsterdam, was to look into the apprehension of Edward Whaley and William Goff. It was upon the arrival of the commission and the 4 frigates filled with armed soldiers that Edward Whaley and William Goff deemed it too dangerous to remain in the port city of New Haven. And so it was at that time that they went to live up in Judge's Cave for a final time. And from there, they departed really up along the Connecticut River to the frontier town of Hadley, Massachusetts. In the latter years of the 1670s, Edward Whaley suffered from a stroke and ultimately passed away. It was at that time that New England's Second Indian War was raging along the frontier towns of the Connecticut River, and Hadley was one of those towns. There's a legend called the Angel of Hadley, in which Hadley was purportedly attacked by Indians and on a Sunday during the Sabbath, and while all the townspeople were in the church, suddenly an elderly man mysteriously burst through the doors, and he was wielding a sword over his head, and he directed the townspeople to their defense, and they were successfully able to reach the town cannon, and they shot it off, and they were able to defend the town from really what could have been a rather grisly massacre. In the fog of war and in the smoke from the cannon, the Angel of Hadley had suddenly disappeared, and nobody knew who it was. So they referred to it as an angel. Well, in reality, that angel may have been William Goff. The reason why the townspeople may have referred to William Goff as an angel was because if they said they knew it was William Goff, then they would have been guilty of treason for harboring this regicide. So they couldn't have said, William Goff saved us. They had to blame it on an angel who suddenly arrived in the town. William Goff certainly would have possessed the military expertise to help the townspeople defend themselves from the Indian invasion. However, there's one small problem with this story. There's no documentary evidence of an actual attack on the town of Hadley. That may have also been on purpose. The early historians of King Philip's War may have deliberately omitted the attack on Hadley out of the history books, which were really written at this time to clear the townspeople of Hadley, to clear the townspeople of Hadley from any associated guilt. It's difficult to say how Edward Whaley and William Goff lived in Hadley, Massachusetts. A visit to the town today really reveals a mile-long green of a very small community consisting of probably, at the time, only a couple of hundred residents. They lived really in the center of the green, on a house in the center of the green with Reverend Russell in the upstairs. It's hard to imagine that Edward Whaley and William Goff could have lived in hiding for 15 years without anybody noticing them living in the upstairs of the house. Conversely, it's also hard to imagine that out of the 200 residents, nobody ever leaked the news that Edward Whaley and William Goff were living in that community. So it's difficult to say how secret of a life they were living. There is one story of the men, well, not one story, there is one incident where the men write a letter to their family members back in England, and they say, you don't have to send me money anymore. We've conducted a prosperous business and trade with the local natives, and we have enough money for ourselves. So if the men were living so privately, it's hard to imagine them being able to conduct this level of business. After Whaley Goff died, and after the Angel of Hadley incident, it's clear from William Goff's letters that he had to move from the town, which is further evidence that the attack on Hadley did occur. He moved down to Hartford, Connecticut, which was a colony now, and that's where William Lee was serving as governor of Connecticut colony. There were a couple of people who pursued a search for William Goff in Hartford, and once again William Lee obstructed the search and covered for William Goff. There are a few scant letters remaining from this period, but unfortunately William Goff lost touch with his family and was really rather desperate to hear from them, and that's really what consists of the content of his last letter, sort of a sad ending of a person who yearned to get back to England and be in touch with his family. The story of the regicides was very important to the new nation in the years during and after the American Revolution. Thomas Hutchinson, the Royalist governor of Massachusetts, liked to use the story of the regicides as proof that the New England colonies were loyal to the British Crown going all the way back to the founding. For after all, if the New England colonies were not loyal to the British Crown, why did Whaley and Goff need to live in hiding during that entire time? However, Ezra Stiles liked to use the story of Whaley and Goff in New Haven as proof of New England colonies' defiance of royal authority going back into the 17th century. In the early 1800s, when the young country really lacked the long and glorious histories associated with the European countries, the story of Edward Whaley and William Goff was an important part of early America's heritage, and you could read their story in the earliest American history books. However, over time, their story began to fade through the social movements and series of wars that took place that we all know in American history, and gradually and by degrees it faded from the history books. John Dixwell's story differs markedly from Edward Whaley and William Goff's. While he lived in Germany in the early 1660s, in 1665 there's evidence that he met with Edward Whaley and William Goff while they were staying in Hadley. From there, John Dixwell moved down to New Haven, changed his name and lived under an alias called James Davids, and he really lived in one of the 9 original squares not far from where I sit today, and he lived a rather open and happy life. It was only after his death that it was revealed that he was John Dixwell, and there's a monument and a grave behind the Center Church on New Haven Green today.